I'm Jolene Wynn, and this is the Porn Addict's Wife podcast, episode number 166, The Problem with Coping Mechanisms. I used to think of myself as the wife of a porn addict, but I do not think of myself that way anymore, and you don't have to either. In this podcast, I am going to teach you how to manage your mind and your emotions so that you can stop living your life around your husband's pornography addiction. I am going to teach you how to stop being the victim and how to conquer his pornography addiction, even if he never does. I'm Jolene Wynn. I am a certified life coach, and I am a member of the LDS faith and the wife of a former porn addict. And this is a podcast for the Porn Addict's Wife. All right, my ladies, how are you this morning? I hope you guys are having a great day. I'm having a very good weekend. I hope you guys are too. I wanted to let you guys know about my in-person retreat. I feel like I haven't talked to you guys enough about this, but it is open and you guys can go get your ticket and reserve your spot today. I am hosting an in-person retreat in Ocean Isle, North Carolina. It's October 19th to the 22nd, and I cannot wait to see who can come. I did my first in-person retreat last year, and it was so powerful, and everyone wanted to do it again, so here we are. There are 14 spots total. Some of those have already been taken, so I believe there are 9 left, and I do have a payment plan option available through July 31st. So if you want to come, it's $1,500 for my clients. It's $1,800 if you are not a client, and there is a payment plan right now that will split that payment up into several monthly payments. That payment option ends on July 31st, and then it will just be a pay in full upfront price. So if the payment option works better for you, then go make sure you reserve your spot today. You can head to my website, jolenewynn.com. You can go to the retreat tab and you will see all the details. This is an in-person, very intimate event. I only take 14 people there because I want everybody to have a really close one-on-one experience with me. I spend one-on-one personal time coaching every single woman who is there. And this year, the thing that I really want to focus on is kind of reinventing or recreating your identity. This has been something that has come up for me this year, just with everything that I've been working through with my husband. There have been so many beliefs that I have recognized and unearthed that I hadn't even realized that I was still holding on to, and they were beliefs that I've been having forever. And as I've started to question them, it has really given me the opportunity to change and evaluate, am I the person that I want to be? And if I'm not, who do I want to become, and deciding that on purpose. So if that feels like something that you're just itching to do, then join today. Reserve your spot. Those will sell out. It sold out last year, and it was just the most beautiful weekend. I remember my twin sister came with me. She's coming again this year. So if you really want to meet her, that would be reason enough to come. But I remember her last year thinking that she was a little, not hesitant to come because she was totally going to come, but she was surprised at how uplifting it was. She said, you would think that getting all of these women around, this group of 14 women who all have a spouse addicted to pornography would be really depressing. She said, but it wasn't. It was so uplifting and so powerful. And one of the things that I think was so powerful, and immediately just very, cohesive, made it very cohesive, very connected to all of these women, is you have something in common. So you walk into this place, we have a beautiful beach house that we're staying at this time, and it's just completely relaxing, and everyone gets it and is so welcoming, and they understand what you're going through without you having to say anything. So you're not by yourself, and you get 3 days without your kids, without your husband, to just focus on you. And if for no other reason than just to get out of the house for 3 days, ladies, let's do it. I would love to see you there. Again, you can go to my website, jolenewynn.com, go to the retreat tab, and you'll be able to see all the details, and you'll be able to reserve your spot today. The second thing that I wanted to remind you all is that I am doing a free coaching call this Wednesday. So on Wednesday, July 19th, let me double check that I have that date right. Yes. At 11 a.m. Eastern, I am hosting a free coaching call, and I want to invite you to come. So if you want to try out coaching, if you have a struggle that you want some help with, come to the call. You can come anonymously, and I will help you work through that. Again, you go to my website, jolenewynn.com, go to the Coach Week tab, and you'll be able to register for free. Even if you can't make it live, if you want to catch the replay, then go ahead and register so that I can send that to you. All right, today, ladies, I want to talk about coping mechanisms. This is something that has come up through just a couple of conversations that I've had with friends this week. And so I really wanted to hit this today and the problem with coping mechanisms. So first of all, let's talk about what that really is. Okay, so I looked up on Google, what is coping? And it says that it's thoughts and behaviors mobilized, isn't that an interesting word, to manage internal and external stressful situations. Okay, let's read that again. For those of you who are really bored by definitions, let's do it again, okay? Coping is when you have thoughts and behaviors and you use them to manage your internal and external stress, right? Sound familiar? Here's the thing about coping mechanisms is we typically think of them in a positive way, right? It's basically conscious buffering. For those of you who have been around for a while, you know that buffering is anything that we do to distract ourselves from how we are feeling. And most of the time, that's very subconscious. We aren't fully aware of that we're doing it, right? Does that make sense? We might overeat or binge watch Netflix or just scroll on our phone, and we do it so subconsciously we aren't even recognizing that we're trying to avoid how we're feeling, right? We aren't aware that we're feeling bored, and so we're scrolling on our phone so that we don't have to feel bored. Or that we are feeling stressed or anxious, and we go to the fridge to see if there's anything in there that might make us take the edge off the stress or anxiety. Right? You guys with me? So that's what I want to offer instead as my definition of coping is conscious buffering. Okay? Coping is when we consciously distract ourselves from our emotions. And typically we feel like this is a very positive thing because we usually do something that is socially acceptable and positive in order to cope. And we use it to take the top level off of what we're feeling. So if you don't know what your coping mechanism is, let me ask you this question and just see what comes up. How do you deal with stress? How do you handle your stress? What do you do to handle the stress in your life? Here's some typical answers. People say exercise or yoga or taking bubble baths or reading or organizing or cleaning, right? Or maybe it's just a version of self-care. You go get your nails done. You take a day off work. You go for a walk. You listen to a podcast, right? These are very typical coping mechanisms that we have. You call your best friend and you vent to her, right? You guys with me? This is the typical response we get. So I want you to think about that again for a minute. How do you deal with stress? One of the ways that I do it, one of the coping mechanisms I have is exercise. Okay, over the last couple of months, as my husband and I have been working through all the things, times when I have felt anxious, this is what I've told my clients, is anxiety makes me feel like I'm either going to throw up or I want to go for a run. And I hate throwing up. I avoid it like the plague. So typically I choose to go for a run. I'll choose to go exercise. And it's actually specifically running. Running is a coping mechanism that I choose occasionally, not very often, but I have chosen in the past to deal with anxiety. And notice even how we phrase that, right? How do you deal with stress? That's what a coping mechanism is. Whatever your answer is for that, it's a coping mechanism. It's even in the name, it's even in how we talk about it. How do you deal with it? It's not how do you overcome it? How do you conquer it? How do you manage it? It's how do you deal with it? As if it's something that you can't overcome. And that's what I want to challenge today. Okay. We're going to do a lot of different examples. But here's just a few, right? A few examples of coping mechanisms, right? You feel stressed, you go for a run. You feel anxious, you write it down. This is something I'm going to go into later as an example. Now, the thing about coping mechanisms is that they work until you can't use that coping mechanism anymore, and then it becomes a problem. Think about this. There are so many people that might have a certain coping mechanism that works until their schedule changes, and then they can no longer do that coping mechanism, right? Let's say your coping mechanism is to take a bubble bath. Well, then let's say you have kids and you're like, well, I can't take an hour-long bubble bath anymore. I have an infant. Or maybe your coping mechanism is sleep. Great, except until you have children again, and then you can no longer take naps and sleep for 8 hours straight because you have a newborn that's waking up every hour and a half to eat, right? And it's not a problem. Coping mechanisms are not a problem until you can no longer cope in the same way that you're used to. Does that make sense? And that's why so many people struggle at certain points when their circumstance shifts, right? Maybe you use physical exercise to cope, which is awesome, because it works until one, you can't use that coping mechanism anymore. Say you get injured and it's no longer possible for you to cope with your internal stress through exercise, or the internal stress becomes so great that your coping mechanism isn't capable of handling the amount of internal stress that you're feeling. You guys with me on this? Your body can only handle so much emotion, and your coping mechanism will only take away so much of that emotion. You guys with me? So when there is a gap, when there is a misalignment between the amount of internal emotion that you're feeling and the amount that the coping mechanism is able to release off of you, that is typically when we have a breakdown. Okay. I even had, you might be using this podcast as a coping mechanism. I had a client that mentioned this. She said that she had been using my podcast like therapy. She said, I've been using your podcast like therapy for 3 years. She's been listening since the beginning, and it was fine until something shifted in her life. A circumstance shifted in her life with her husband. And then there was so much emotional stress that just listening to the podcast wasn't enough anymore. She didn't even realize she was using it as a coping mechanism, but that's what it was. And the problem with that is, again, either when the coping mechanism, you are no longer able to use that coping mechanism for whatever reason, or the amount of internal stress increases to the point where the coping mechanism doesn't take enough off the surface. That's when everything else underneath it that you've been trying to just take the top off the surface, that's when it all floods. And that's when we feel overwhelmed. That's when we have our breakdowns. Okay. So this kind of begs the question for me is, how do you know if you're coping or not? Right? Because a lot of us don't even know. Hopefully some of you became aware a little bit just by answering that question that I asked you in the beginning of how do you deal with stress? What do you do? Hopefully that helped you a little bit. But here's a way that I have found, the main point that I see in how you can tell whether it's a coping mechanism or not, is that when you are coping, you find yourself in repeated patterns. It doesn't actually solve the problem. The problem stays the same, okay? You do okay for a while, but you find yourself coming back to the same recurring issue or concern or emotional struggle. It's something you can't seem to just get over. You can't get past it. It keeps coming back up, okay? I'm gonna go through some examples to hopefully clarify this. So for example, you may cope with frustration with your children if you're a parent by venting to other mom friends, but it doesn't actually make you feel any less frustrated with your kids or yell at them less, right? You still have a problem yelling at your kids. You still feel really frustrated with your kids. So coping might look like venting to your mom friends about it, and it might feel better for just a minute. It might just take the edge off because somebody else resonates with you and they validate your feelings, but it doesn't make it any easier that night not to yell at your kids and feel frustrated when you put them to bed for the 47th time. Right? And that cycle just perpetuates day after day, month after month, year after year. You guys with me? Another example, you may cope with your husband's pornography problem by journaling or inhaling self-help, right? A lot of people do this. And this might make you feel better temporarily, but it doesn't actually work through the undercurrent of emotions that you're feeling in the first place. So they always show back up. This is one of the number one comments that I get from podcast listeners. I will get emails and messages on Instagram that say, I have been listening to your podcast. It's helped me so much, but I keep coming back to this same problem. I think I'm doing really well for a while, and then circumstance will shift and something will happen. My husband will relapse, and then all of a sudden I feel like I'm back at square one. That is a really big red flag indication that you're just using this as a coping mechanism. And maybe you're taking something from it and you're applying it in little ways that you can, but there's obviously something underneath that you're not able to grasp. And this is not your fault. This is something that's very difficult to do. Again, the subconsciousness that we have is called subconscious for a reason. There are things that our brain is wired to avoid looking at, which is why it's so helpful to have a coach, to have someone else outside of you come help you look at it, because your brain wants to avoid it at all costs, right? So this is why it's so helpful, because you are literally, your brain is working against you, right? So if you feel like that, if that resonates with you, then that can be an indication that you're using the podcast, or the podcast has simply become a way to cope week after week and just get you to the next one. Does that make sense? Another example, and this came from a conversation that I had with a friend this week, and it kind of inspired the podcast, is she feels a lot of anxiety. And one of the ways that she copes with her anxiety is she keeps a notepad by her bed. And if she wakes up in the middle of the night because of her thoughts or things she's anxious about, she'll write that down so that she can go back to sleep. And that's great until tomorrow night, and it happens again. And tomorrow when she wakes up and she's still anxious about the thing, she still has the same thoughts. She looks at that notepad and all of a sudden the anxiety comes back to the surface. Do you guys see what I'm saying? And then now not only does she have the anxiety she's dealing with, she also has the exhaustion on top of the anxiety, right? And today I want to offer that there is an alternative, and that alternative is to learn the source of what's underneath. What is the source of her anxiety? If she actually learned the source of her anxiety and faced it and conquered it, then the cycle stops and the need for the notepad disappears. You guys with me? The alternative to coping is actually facing the problem, the underlying issue, and conquering it. Okay? When you learn how to manage your mind and master your emotions, the need to cope disappears. The beautiful byproduct of this too is that you can then in turn choose to continue participating in those activities that you typically use just to cope, and then you get to do them out of enjoyment rather than out of an attempt to escape your inner emotional turmoil, right? It actually frees you to take pleasure in those activities rather than use them because you'll break if you don't, right? So when you confront and conquer the underlying causes of those coping mechanisms, you are no longer attempting to revolve your life around avoiding, but instead are focused on confronting, and it's all internal. It's a mental shift into true acceptance and responsibility for your thoughts and feelings so that you can master both to control your own life, rather than continue in a cycle of simply trying to cope with life. It's a true shift out of victim mentality and a huge leap into taking control of yourself again. Now, that same client that I mentioned earlier who had been kind of using the podcast as a coping mechanism, right? She wrote this, and she's been coaching for 1 month. She joined my program a month ago. I kind of sent out this to write to my clients and gave them the option to answer, and she wrote this. The question was, looking back to before you began coaching, what has your transformation looked like? She said, it looks like this. I have good and bad days, but when the bad days come, I have a coach and a group of women that know what it's like, and they give me the support that I need to get through those bad days or weeks. Before I joined coaching, I only listened to the podcast and they were like therapy for me. But doing the coaching and having access to the materials and the group calls is so much better than just listening to podcasts. The reason that I wanted to share that with you is because this is such a good example to me. She is in the process of shifting from coping to conquering. She is learning the difference and making permanent changes. And that's really the key. Coping provides a temporary relief. Conquering provides permanent peace. Which would you rather have? It's entirely up to you. I love you ladies so much. I'll see you guys next week on a brand new episode. So take care. All right, ladies, if you are loving what you are learning on the podcast, I want to invite you to come join my coaching program. This is where we take it to the next level and we actually start applying and learning the how of moving forward. This podcast has taught you the what, and the coaching program is where you're going to learn the how. This is where you learn how to actually start moving forward, process all of that pain that you feel, and let it go once and for all. If you are ready to finally move forward and stop living a life that revolves around your husband's pornography addiction, then I want to invite you to come join me today. Just head to my website, joleneWynn.com, and sign up today. I can't wait to see you there.